Good morning, everybody. My name's Don, and I'm an alcoholic. And thank you, Al, for that beautiful send-off talking about Clancy. And thank you all for inviting me. I'm mighty grateful to be here, and among such lofty company as the rest of the speakers, because you guys have got a great conference lined up. I don't know about your kickoff speaker, but the rest of them are really spectacular. And Al has given me finally a really wonderful, clear topic. Over the years, I've accused Al of giving me topics like reconcile Thomas Aquinas with the fifth tradition. But this one is just beautiful. It's simply the spiritual program of action. And I'm not going to talk about it all day, but I believe I could talk all day about the spiritual program of action, because it truly is everything to me. And the spiritual program of action to me boils down to the action that is the 12 steps. And for me, this program is action. One of the greatest turning points, which remains a turning point because I have to return to it, that I've ever experienced, was beginning to realize that my thoughts, feelings, and beliefs that I thought were the center of absolutely everything have never one time left a footprint on reality. They are really just a will-o'-the-wisp between my ears. They don't have any substance. Now, if I abdicate my behavior to them, they leave a great big ugly footprint right in the middle of reality. But in and of themselves, they don't and they can't. The only way they impact reality is for me to act on them. And the realization was that, and is, that I can behave different and better than the old crazy picture show in the back of my head. I remember being told within days of getting sober, and my sobriety date, by the way, is April 9 of 1981. My sponsor is Bob B. from St. Paul, Minnesota. My current sponsor. I've had several wonderful sponsors throughout my sobriety. My home group is the Calm Down group. And I named that group 35 years ago when a couple of other guys and I started it because it meets on Wednesday. And particularly at that point in my life, by Wednesday, I really needed to calm down. But my recovery is not what goes through my head. My recovery today is what I do. One of the most, I was told during that conversation a few days after I got sober, I was told that I had enough information about AA and had enough information about AA for at least 2 years to stay sober the rest of my life without learning a single new piece of information about AA or recovery. They explained to me that what was killing me was not what I knew and didn't know. What was killing me was what I was doing and not doing. And that was a huge turning point when I realized that I could uncouple my behavior from the old crazy picture show in the back of my head. And one of the many miracles that's flowed from that is it turns out that it's like everything else. When I behave right, I usually eventually wind up thinking, feeling, and believing a whole lot closer to right. But if I keep waiting to be fixed so that I think, feel, and believe in order to behave, in order to act, I just mire further down in the mud. The big book, of course, says that the spiritual life is not a theory. We have to live it. And that kind of sums the whole thing up. I was told early on that the action that is the 12 steps, the action that is the first 9 steps, that which brings us to a state of recovery temporarily and deflates our egos very temporarily, immediately followed by the action that is steps 10, 11, and 12. That behavior, those actions, are literally the prescription for alcoholism. That they work on alcoholism precisely like an antibiotic works on an infection. If I have an infection that's going to kill me if it's not treated, but will respond to antibiotics, I don't need to understand the origin and nature of my infection. I could learn everything there is to know about the infection. And if I don't take the stupid pills, I'm dead. It doesn't matter what I know. I don't need to understand how an antibiotic works in the human body. I don't need to believe that taking those little pills can take care of these terrible things wrong with wonderful me. And probably more important than any to me, I don't need to want to take the pills. Whether or not I want to take the pills couldn't be more irrelevant. If I have the infection and I take the pills as directed, I will get just fine. And they promised me that the action that is the 12 steps will work precisely that way. And the fact that I'm with you folks today, instead of having been rotting in a pauper's grave for over 39 years, is pretty good evidence to me that it works. It really does. And I've been blessed by seeing that miracle happen in hundreds of people over the time of my sobriety. I don't think I can read, think, and discuss myself into a spiritual state. I think I have to behave myself into a spiritual state. And I believe that in any given moment, I am just precisely as spiritual as I am behaving. And there's certain little simple things that contribute so much to spirituality, I believe. And 2 of them are courtesy and persistence. And here's what I believe about courtesy. I think it is the single most under-discussed, most underrated spiritual trait. Because if I am unfailingly courteous, I've got a really good chance of behaving like a spiritual person would behave. On the other hand, I don't believe it's possible. I know it's not possible for me, and I doubt it is for anybody. I don't believe it's possible to be discourteous and spiritual at the same time. I do not think they can coexist. And I believe that there's no excuse for ever being discourteous. Now, in my business, as well as my life and sponsoring and quite a lot of people, I have to tell people some things that are pretty harsh facts, really harsh facts. But I can tell them that with compassion and courtesy. And when I do that, the conversations go better every single time. And another thing that's a huge contributor in my mind for living a spiritual life is the prayer of St. Francis. If I take that prayer of St. Francis with me throughout the day and silently and repetitively say to myself over and over, before and during my human encounters, Lord, please let me lay aside whether I get any love, comfort, or understanding out of this transaction, and let me seek to love, comfort, and understand the other person or people involved. When I do that and couple it with praying to give my entire interest, attention, and love to whomever or whatever really is immediately in front of me in the absolute right now, I'm a long way down the road to living a spiritual life. Practicing these principles in all of our affairs is the bedrock, of course, of living a spiritual life. And there's absolutely no new spiritual ideas in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. There are new ideas on carrying the message, and there are wonderful new ideas on lots of things. But spiritual truth has always been here. And Bill's genius and God's grace and intervention in the writing of the big book, in my opinion, packaged it in a form that was so simple and applied so directly to our situation as humanly hopeless alcoholics that it performs the miracles of our sobriety. But the core truth is that thinking about myself will lead me to the abyss, and trying to serve only myself will lead me to the abyss. On the other hand, leaving my welfare up to a loving God. And when I don't feel that way, it works just as well when I behave like a person who is leaving their own welfare up to a loving God. And I'm concentrating on what I can do, to quote my AA hero, Chuck C., what I can do to help God's kids do what they need to have done for fun and for free because I want to. Real miracles happen. Real miracles happen. And I think persistence is so important in spirituality. I don't know if I have any spirituality, but if I have any, it's because of persistence. You see, when the process of working, doing the steps, didn't make me a spiritual person. But just as the 12th step promised, what it did, it awakened me spiritually. I had been comatose to the fact that I am indeed a spiritual creature in God's spiritual world. And the process, the action of those steps awakened me to that situation. And after becoming awakened to it, of course, the question was in my mind, how do I become spiritual? What do I need to learn? And it turned out that I didn't really need to learn all that much. And please don't misunderstand me. I am all for the wonderful spiritual books that are not AA books. I'm all for the great truths that are in the Bible. But I really believe this. My original sponsor was a guy by the name of Cherry Carpenter, not Jerry, but Cherry Carpenter in Nashville, Tennessee. And Cherry said that when a person kind of skimmed over the big book and the steps, and then threw themselves into all the outside spiritual and psychological and self-help literature, that they were standing on a whale's back, fishing for minnows. And I believe that, because the big book is indeed, for me, the spiritual whale. Everything that I need to know to behave spiritually and live a spiritual program of action I can find in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Cherry went on to say that he himself was going to get into all of that outside literature just as soon as he mastered the Big Book. And as you probably suspect, Cherry never mastered the Big Book, nor have I. Or I suspect none of us have ever mastered the Big Book. That thing is so chock full of wonderful, wonderful directions. And that's what saved my life, was just simply following the directions in the Big Book. Probably the biggest gift God ever gave me, the one that allowed me to get sober and allows me to stay sober today, was the gift of knowing that my behavior is the reality. And that if I am to have a spiritual life, if I'm to live a spiritual program of action, I can't do it sequestered in my room with a stack of spiritual books. I can't do it by praying unceasingly. Now, all those things are great, and they prepare me for what I think really is a spiritual life. And I think a spiritual life is being of use and help to God's other children. You know, I don't have any tangible, direct contact with God, and I don't know of anybody who does have any tangible, direct contact with God. And as far as serving God, I can't imagine what it is that God needs that God doesn't have and needs me to supply, except one thing, and that is serving God's other kids. And to me, when I have behaved correctly until my mind is right, when I see you, I see God. And that's the only time that I really can see God. You are the form that God has for me. And I believe that anything that I do to my sister, to or for my sisters or brothers, that I do to God and for God. So that is the way that I believe a spiritual life, my spiritual life, has to be based, is to quit making it all about me. Another thing about seeking to live a spiritual program of action, one of the biggest enemies or one of the biggest obstacles to that for me is my big deals. Cherry told me that I had a disease of big deals, that anything that my ego could make about me, I would blow it up into a great big deal. And my life, well, I thought big deals were good. I thought having big deals was what life ought to be about. But Cherry explained to me that the truth is, anytime I make a big deal out of anything that is not God or the 12 steps, what I'm really making a big deal out of is me. You know, the very same thing can happen to you and me. And it's not a big deal when it happens to you, but it's a big deal when it happens to me. And big deals absolutely cripple me. It's awfully hard for me to behave or feel spiritual when I'm in the midst of one of my big deals. And over the years, I've been blessed with knowing a lot of really successful people. People who were widely recognized as being very, very spiritually successful or accomplished. I've known people that have made a world of money and great impacts on economic things with what they did. And you know, all those people who have been highly successful, I really don't remember one of them ever having a big deal. And that's true in the material realm as well as the spiritual. I'm a lawyer, is my profession. Had a couple of 3 years off for bad behavior back before I got sober. But other than that, I've been a lawyer for 52 years. But I've known some really high level, nationally prominent, successful lawyers. And those folks never have a big deal. It doesn't make any difference how many zeros is on it. It doesn't make any difference what's dependent on the client's life or whatever. It's not a big deal. They're important deals. They're serious deals. They're deals that require our utmost attention and effort. But to them, they approach it. They approach a death penalty murder case with the same angle of approach, and that's my favorite definition of attitude, by the way. I'm going to take a side trip and talk about that because that was a huge turning point for me. But let me finish on the lawyers. The folks that are really, really successful, they just take the next stitch. It doesn't make any difference what's at stake. It doesn't change what the next stitch is. And they just calmly take the next stitch. On the other hand, there used to be half a dozen lawyers who would hang around police court in Louisville trying to snag $10 or $20 from somebody on a traffic ticket. And I knew those guys really well. I loved them. I was over in the courts about every day in that period, or every day in that period. And some of them rode bicycles down to the courthouse. Some of them took the bus and wearing old suits with the rear end so frayed you could practically see through it. But sweet guys. And I could walk in that courthouse any morning and call one of them aside and ask them what was going on. And they would be eaten up with big deals. Bottom line for me is big deals cripple me. They cripple me spiritually. They cripple me professionally, economically. They cripple me relationship-wise, because when I've got big deals going on, I'm not a very good husband, father, sponsor, friend. I'm distracted. My back is broken by my own ego, by blowing it up way beyond its proportion. But anyway, returning to angle of approach, and this really, really has helped me to live a spiritual program of action. In early sobriety, as I suspect all of us, I heard an awful lot about my attitude, that I needed to change my attitude, that I was going to get drunk if I didn't change my attitude, and I needed to have an attitude of gratitude. Well, by that time, I really had gotten to the point where I wanted to live and I wanted to try to get this thing. So I tried every way I knew. I'd meditate, I'd pray, I'd make lists, I'd do little inventories. I even got a little outside counseling about adjusting my attitude. And finally, Cherry presented me with an old dictionary that was published in the 1930s and told me to look up the word attitude. And I was intellectually insulted, of course, but I looked up the word attitude. And the first definition had nothing to do with what I had thought attitude absolutely was. It had nothing to do with my mindset with regard to something. It had nothing to do with the way I felt about something. It was a definition from geometry and aviation. It was angle of approach. approach. And folks, that was like turning the light on in a dark room. It changed everything because I realized, love that word realize. That means I came into reality inside me, so different from knowing. But I began to realize that my angle of approach toward anyone or anything is not the way I think, feel, and believe about it. My angle of approach toward anything or anyone is the way I behave toward it. So the absolute magic of that was that instantly my attitude went from the way I am, my mindset, my emotions, over which I have no immediate control, to my behavior, over which, one stitch at a time, I have absolute control. So that was magic of knowing that I could indeed change my attitude at the drop of a hat anytime. And of course, there's some magic with all of those things like that. When I behave with a proper angle of approach toward anybody or anything, my mind generally straightens out. But I honestly have reached a point where that's not all that important to me, whether my mind straightens out or not, because I know that's not ever going to leave a footprint on reality. I know that the world has never given a hoot what goes through the old crazy picture show in the back of my head. Their judgment of, their opinion of me is based 100% on my behavior. And I believe God evaluates me the exact same way. You know, think that through. If God is the kind of entity that would put something unbidden, involuntarily in our heads and hearts, and then smack the crap out of us because it was there, we might as well shut the meeting down and just go get drunk or something, because we all screwed if God is of that nature. No, I believe the most spiritual I ever get. I believe the highest level of living a spiritual program of action is when I take that next stitch where the divine spark tells me to take it. And when I talk about the divine spark, I'm talking about something that has many names. Conscience, moral compass, better angels. Conventional Christians often call it the Holy Spirit. But by whatever name, it's that tiny little piece of God that I believe is in every single one of us, that knows only in the absolute right now our own next action. My God indeed lights my path, but my God lights my path with a pin light for each single step, never once with a floodlight for me to see 100 yards down the road. And I don't need to be distracting myself from what I can do, which is that next stitch in the proper place, worrying about what's going to happen with stitches 8, 10, 32 down the line. I need to just do that. But at any rate, that definition of attitude has absolutely changed my life and changes my life today. Give you an example of that working in my life. About 15 years ago, I picked up sponsee, and that sponsee is very troubled. Bless his heart, he has some disorder that I suspect is at least some little bit of autism, and behavior problems, and often I can't make sense of what's being said. And he has a habit about once every 6 months giving me a terrible cussing, just terrible cussing. And I was really busy in the early 15 years ago. And I bet I practiced my speech of telling him I wasn't going to tell him he was the first one, but that I was going to give when I fired my first sponsee, because I've never fired a sponsee and have no plans to fire one. But I thought I needed to get out from under the stress that this was causing me. And besides, I was thinking, I don't know anything about mental illness. I don't have any credentials on mental illness. And I'm 60, then I was in my 60s, I'm 60 years old. I've got all these responsibilities. I can't be babysitting this thing. But I never could get it to feel right. Just never could. So what I did, I started behaving like I had absolutely embraced this fellow. I started really seeking to give my entire interest, attention, and love to him. I started trying, as Dr. Paul says in his story, I started trying to focus my magic magnifying mind on the good and the humor that was in him. And I kept on doing that, and it wasn't long before I loved that guy so much, and still do today, that I wouldn't take anything for my friendship with that fellow. And it's all due to the fact that I altered my angle of approach. I altered my behavior toward that sponsee. And it performs miracles in every area of life. If I take the angle of approach into my human relations, and I bet I've prayed 20 times since this meeting started to give you folks my entire interest, attention, and love, and to lay aside whether you guys think I look good up here, and whether I'm impressing people, and whether I'm dropping spiritual gems for you all the time, but seeking to be of help to you, to somehow love, comfort, and understand you. And when I do that, and I have to do it over and over and over again, that's where persistence comes in, as being so important to me. The only thing I've done perfectly since April 9th of 1981 is not put a drink in me. Everything else has been a matter of taking a couple of stitches in the right place, getting knocked over by some form of self-will, getting up, dusting myself off, saying, oops, Mom, Dad, I'm sorry, I screwed up. Taking another couple of stitches in the right place, getting knocked over again. And I'm talking about a process that doesn't quite average 50 to 100 times today. But in the early years of trying to live that way, it certainly did happen 50 to 100 times a day. And I thought every time that happened, it was an interruption of my spiritual growth. But I've come to know or believe that process of failure, asking for forgiveness, and correction is the only spiritual growth of which I am capable. And based on the blessings that my God has showered on me in sobriety, seems like to me God is pretty pleased with our persistence. It's amazing. If I just take as a keynote of my day persistence and courtesy, if I don't think about another spiritual principle the entire day, the odds are I'm going to have a pretty good day. And at the end of that day, I'm going to look back and say, I didn't do all that bad. on the spiritual program of action today. I want to talk a little bit about how step 6 and 7 made such a huge difference in my life, and they are right in the middle of the spiritual program of action for me today. They went from neglected steps in my life for the first 9 years I was sober to pretty well the cornerstone of my life for the last 30 years. But after I'd done my 4th and 5th step, I formed a picture of what I thought a spiritual Don ought to be like. I know now it was a self-determined objective, but I didn't know that for 9 years. And after I'd done that 5th step, I went back to my attic. I had my very own attic by that time. I was about 8 months sober, I think. I wasn't a shelf in the place. So I got laid the big book up on the bed, took it down off the bed because the book says we took the book, big book says we took this book down from the shelf. So I took it off the bed, looked at my Timex watch, and I spent exactly 1 hour going through what I'd done on steps 1 through 5. And I had no illusions that I was summa cum laude, but it looked like I'd probably gotten over the bar. So I got down on my knees and I said that 7-step prayer. And I believed with all my heart, in the best of faith, that was the point where, with God's help, I went to work on me to make me into what I had decided a spiritual Don ought to be. And I flew that way for 9 years, until May of 1990. And I didn't know what was wrong because, you see, I didn't have any bad objectives. The two main things that were just killing me were relationships with women and financial chaos. And my objectives were good. I didn't want a harem. I wanted a monogamous, spiritually based relationship that a woman and I could comfortably go through life together. All I wanted. With regard to money, I didn't want to be rich. I never really wanted to be rich, and I still didn't then. But I wanted the craziness to start. Well, I had to restart my law practice after losing everything. A couple of years after I got sober, I got my law license back and came back to Louisville to try to make a law practice. But it was working pretty well. I was making money. I had been stuck up in front of 2,000 people to tell my story when I was 22 months sober. And they taped it and they sent it everywhere, and people started asking me to speak all around everywhere, and people started asking me to be their sponsor. My daughter, who I did not see for over 3 years during my hitting bottom and early sobriety, same month that I gave that talk, I saw her for the first time. She moved in with me two months later and lived with me throughout her high school year. So everything was great, except those two things were killing me. And what I would do, I would use the best tools. I would use prayer, steps, sponsors, meetings, outside counseling. And I would slam whatever character defect was making my self-centered butt uncomfortable up against the wall and say, come here, God, give me a little help and we'll get rid of this thing. And God never showed up once, and I had no idea what was wrong. Well, something happened in May of 1990, which caused me to reassess 6 and 7 and to begin to realize, although I knew every word of the less than half a page that the big book devotes to 6 and 7, I began to realize that I had missed about all the boats on 6 and 7. First one I'd missed doesn't say anything in there about me working on any character defects, with or without God's help. Talks about God removing the character defects. And the only action we need to take is to lay them before God and say, Mom, Dad, I'm stumped. I don't know what needs to be taken away. I don't know when it needs to be taken away. And God knows I don't know how to take it away. But I'm going to try to behave like a little child who trusts you. And I'm going to try to just take that next stitch in the right place and let you lead me where I need to be led. And another thing that I had wrong was what I thought my problem with perfection is. I thought my problem was my inability to attain it. And I certainly am unable to attain it, but that's never really mattered. My problem's deeper than that. My problem with perfection is I can't recognize it. I wouldn't know perfection if it came riding through here on a motor scooter. I'm 76, been sober 39 years. If God said, Don, tell me who and what you need to be for the time you've got left on this earth, I'd have no idea. It'd be like a blind dog in a butcher shop. Next thing I had wrong, 7-step prayer doesn't ask God to remove all my defects of character. It certainly doesn't ask God to remove the ones that are making my self-centered butt uncomfortable and embarrassing me. Nor does it ask God to remove the ones that I think are inconsistent with what a spiritual Don ought to be. It asks God to remove only the defects of character that stand in the way of my usefulness to God and my fellows. And folks, this idea is at the very heart of a spiritual program of action for me. If I try to do all this for myself, to make myself sober and happy and spiritual, I may stay sober and I may have a pretty good life, but I'm going to miss the real magic. If I'm going to really find the real magic, I've got to be doing this for you, not for me. Sure, I've got to behave properly. I've got to behave properly. I've got to behave in such a way as to position me to be a channel for God. And that behavior, one stitch at a time, is up to me. I either follow the divine spark, or I let my fear or greed, lust, or something knock me off of that, and I start off on the wrong path. But at any rate, it's not just 6 and 7. The idea that our real purpose is not us being sober, spiritual, and happy is not limited to 6 and 7. It is the span of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. 3rd step prayer. Take away my difficulties, not so I can be sober and spiritual and happy, but take away my difficulties that they might bear witness to God's power, love, and way of life. Steps 8 and 9, all about the practical matter of cleaning up our past and putting our lives in order. Look on page 77. It clearly says, yes, we are doing that, but that is not our real purpose. Our real purpose is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and those around us. And it's in the book many, many more times. That's the objective here. The objective is to find a power greater than ourselves who will solve our problems and who will fit us to be of service to another human being. And when I try to live that way and stumble in that direction, and accepting, by the way, I believe I get closer to living a spiritual program of action when I accept that the only glimpse of God's will I'm ever going to get is in the absolute right now for my own next action. See, you and I believe that we know God's will for 5 seconds from now. We believe that I'm going to be running my mouth now. It's going to be thinking, good God, is he going to shut up on time? But the truth is, we could spend the rest of the day talking about things that would absolutely change God's will for 5 seconds from now. And they range from technical difficulties to a nuclear attack and everything in between. And yet I want to study about God's will for next Tuesday and 10 years from now. Only glimpse I get in the right now, and the only power I have is over that next action. That's the only power I've ever had, and the only power that I will ever have. Now, the divine spark's direction for that action factors in probabilities. It factors in my background, my experience, my education. It factors in all that. But as far as my actual power, it's over that next stitch. Now, there are probabilities of what will happen because of that next stitch, but I never have a guarantee. It's like letting an arrow go from a bow. I can aim it carefully and aim it just at the right spot, but I don't know what the wind's going to do. I lose total control of that arrow when I let it go. And at any given time, I am either the fellow who accepts those limits on his true knowledge of God's will, or I am an ant on a log floating down the river, thinking I'm steering the log, driving myself crazy, running back and forth, ignoring the little ant crap that I could and should be doing, trying to do something that's just totally and completely beyond me, steering the log. And it's not very hard to see in which of those states of angles of approach a person's going to be more comfortable and more effective and more able to be helpful to their fellows. It's the one that accepts that the reality is right now. God is only in the right now. I've got a dear sponsee who says that if he goes into the future, God says, have a big time, Leon. I'll be here when you get back. Same thing if we go into the past. If I go into the past or future, if I go into the past, I'll find dragons. If I go into the future, I'll find monsters. Because I'll go without my armor. I'll go without my God. But at any rate, when I stay in the moment, when I seek to love, comfort, and understand my fellows, when I seek to give whomever or whatever is directly in front of me my entire interest, attention, and love, when I accept all my limitations, when I accept that I can't deliver the message to anybody, thank God for the word carry in the 12th step. If that word had been delivered, it would be an impossible order. And I need to understand that the delivery of the message is up to God and the other person. My job is to be the quiet, loving messenger by carrying the message. And I carry a message every minute of every day. We all do. And I want to seek to have a demeanor that will invite people to bring their problems to me rather than repel them. I want to seek to be an example of God and the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous working in my life. I want to be kind of a little tiny billboard of, hey, Alcoholics Anonymous works. Alcoholics Anonymous is a happy place. It's an totally open-armed, welcoming place. And we in Alcoholics Anonymous love you. And when I'm able to succeed in that angle of approach, I probably am pretty close to a spiritual program of action. I love you all, and I thank you all so much for having me, and especially Al. Thank you. God bless, and have a wonderful day. Enjoy the rest of the conference.